She was still wearing the veil. That was the thing she would think about later, in the particular silence of a very large car moving through a city that did not know her name, that she had run from the church, through the side door that the caterers used, down the alley that smelled of restaurant grease and city rain, across 2 blocks of wet pavement in heels that were not designed for running, and into the first open door she had found, and through all of it, through every second of the flight, the veil had stayed on her head. She had not noticed until she was inside. By then it was too late to go back. The car was already moving. She had not planned this. She needed to be clear about that, at least to herself. Sitting in the back of a vehicle she had not hired with her heart, doing something percussive and uncontrolled against her ribs. She had not woken up this morning knowing she would not go through with it. She had woken up this morning the same way she had woken up every morning for the last 4 months, with the wedding a fixed point on the horizon, something she was moving toward because the momentum of it had become its own force, because the invitations had gone out and the dress had been fitted, and her mother had cried with happiness twice already, and the thing that lived in her chest every time she thought about standing at that altar had seemed like something she was supposed to manage, not something she was supposed to listen to. She had listened to it this morning. She had been standing in the bridal room, the small side room of the church that smelled of old wood and someone's lily-heavy perfume, and her maid of honor had been adjusting the veil and saying something about timelines and cues, and Nadia had looked at her own face in the mirror, and the thing in her chest had said, with a clarity she had not previously given it room for, "No, not him, not this, not today." She had said she needed a moment. She had taken the moment out the caterer's door and kept walking. The car had been there with its back door open, the driver's partition up, the interior dark and quiet and large, and she had made the kind of decision that is not really a decision, but a movement of the body before the mind has properly voted. Now, she was here. She pressed herself into the far corner of the back seat and tried to breathe. The car was exceptional. That was the surface-level observation her brain offered in lieu of anything more useful. Not just expensive, though it was clearly that the leather of the seat was the kind of quality that had no visible stitching, the carpet beneath her ruined heels a deep charcoal, the interior so quiet that the city outside might as well have been happening on another planet. There was a privacy partition between her and the driver, dark glass, and she could see nothing through it. She could not tell if the driver had seen her get in. He must have. The car had been stationary when she entered, and it had begun moving within 30 seconds. He had not spoken. He had not stopped. He had simply driven, as if a woman in a wedding dress appearing in his back seat was either expected or unremarkable. She looked at the veil. She reached up and removed it with hands that were not entirely steady, and held it in her lap, and looked at it. All that white tulle that had cost more than her first semester of university, and that she had spent 3 separate appointments choosing, and felt a wave of something that was not grief and was not relief, but was made of both. The city moved past the tinted windows. She had no phone. She had left it with her things in the bridal room, which meant there was no one she could call, and no one who could call her, which was either a disaster or a mercy, and she was not yet sure which. She thought about Marcus waiting at the altar. She felt a specific kind of guilt that was different from regret. She was not sorry about the decision, but she was sorry about the way it was being delivered. The fact of 200 guests and a priest and a man who had not done anything wrong except be the wrong person, which was not a crime, was in fact nobody's fault. And yet, here she was, delivering this information in the worst possible format. She pressed her back against the seat and looked at the ceiling of the car and breathed. The car kept moving. She did not know where they were going. She did not ask. She sat in the dark, quiet luxury of someone else's vehicle and let the city pass, and felt the panic slowly, very slowly, begin to separate from something else underneath it. Something that was not panic. Something that had been there all along below the momentum and the fittings and her mother's happy tears, waiting for the noise to stop so it could be heard. The veil was soft in her hands. Outside, the city became less city. She could feel the change in the quality of the light through the tinted glass, the intervals between buildings growing longer. She did not know how long she had been in the car. 20 minutes. 30, longer, possibly. Time was doing the thing it did in crises, becoming unreliable, stretching and compressing without pattern. The driver had still not spoken. She thought about this. She thought about the specific quality of the silence, which was not the silence of someone ignoring her. It was more considered than that. It was the silence of someone who was giving her something deliberately, space, or time, or simply the grace of not being asked to explain herself before she had the words. She did not know why she felt this from someone she had not seen. She looked at the partition. Dark glass, completely opaque from her side. She thought, I should say something. She thought, I don't know what to say. She thought, whoever you are, thank you for driving. She said nothing. She held the veil and looked at the city becoming not city outside the window, and breathed. Somewhere in the third hour, the car slowed at a long red light, and in the stillness of the stop, for reasons she would not afterward be able to fully explain, some shift in the light from the street outside, some change in the angle she looked at the rearview mirror. The partition was still dark, but the mirror was angled, and in it, she saw his eyes. She had been expecting, in the vague way you have expectations about unseen things, something ordinary. Something that matched the rest of the situation, a driver, a professional, someone doing a job. She had not expected this. His eyes in the mirror were the color of deep water at dusk, a gray so dark it read almost as something else entirely, and they were already looking at her. Not the glance of someone who had checked the mirror and happened to catch her looking. Something more deliberate than that. Something that suggested he had known she would look at this moment, and had been waiting for it with a patience that was not the patience of ordinary waiting, but of someone for whom time moved differently. He did not look away when she met his eyes in the mirror. She did not look away either. She felt it move through her. Not fear, exactly. Something more complicated than fear. Something with more components. Something her body recognized even though her mind had not yet caught up with the recognition. 3 hours of silence, and now this. His eyes in a mirror at a red light, at the edge of a city she had fled into, without a plan. His eyes that were old in a way she did not have immediate language for. Old and very steady, and looking at her, with something that was not the neutral professional gaze of a driver checking on a passenger. Something that knew her. She did not understand how that was possible. The light changed. He looked back at the road. She sat in the back seat of the car, with the veil in her lap and her heart doing something entirely new, and understood that wherever this car was going, she was not afraid of the destination. She had stopped counting the minutes. This was unusual for her. Nadia was a counter by nature, a measurer of intervals, a person who knew without checking how long things had been and how long they had left to go. It was a skill she had developed in childhood, in a house where timing mattered and unpredictability was the thing you braced against, and she had carried it into adulthood as a kind of internal instrument, always running, always calibrating. The instrument had gone quiet sometime after the red light. She sat in the corner of the back seat and looked at her hands in her lap, the veil folded over them, and tried to assemble what she knew. She was in a car she had not hired. The car was very expensive and very quiet, and moving with the certainty of a predetermined destination. The driver had not asked her where she wanted to go, which meant either he knew, or he had decided, or he was going somewhere of his own, and had simply brought her along as an unremarked addition to a journey already in progress. She had seen his eyes. She returned to this the way you return to a word you have read that you don't recognize compulsively, looking for the key that would make it legible. His eyes in the mirror had done something to her that she was not equipped to categorize. She had felt seen. That was the most basic version of it, the simplest reduction. But it was not simple. It was seen in the specific way of being seen by someone who already knew what they were looking at. Not discovering her, but recognizing her, which were different things entirely, and both of them unsettling for different reasons. She was a practical person. This was something she took seriously. She had grown up in a family of practical people, had been educated in practical things, had made practical decisions, had agreed to marry a practical man who had practical plans and a practical future, and who had never once made her feel, in 2 years, the thing she had felt in 3 seconds of eye contact with a stranger, in a mirror. She did not know what to do with that information. She looked out the window. They were well clear of the city now. The landscape outside the tinted glass was transitional, the kind of territory between urban and rural that had not yet decided what it was. Long stretches of road between clusters of building. Trees beginning to appear with more regularity. She thought about Marcus. She thought about him the way you think about something you are responsible for having hurt, with a specific quality of attention that was not love, but was not nothing. He would have been told by now. Someone would have gone looking and found the veil room empty, and worked it out. Her mother would have been called. Her mother would be somewhere in a state of distress that Nadia could picture precisely, and that produced in her an exhausted preemptive guilt. She thought, I will call when I have a phone. I will explain as much as explanation can do. I will not pretend it was the right way to do this. But I will not pretend the alternative was possible either. She had made her decision. She sat with it. The car turned off the main road onto something smaller, tree-lined, the quality of the surface different under the tires, and she felt the change in direction, and looked out the window, and saw only trees, and the last of the afternoon light coming through them, in long horizontal bars. She looked at the partition. She thought about speaking. She had been thinking about speaking for most of the last hour, and had not done it, and she was beginning to understand that her silence had become a kind of choice also, that she was participating in whatever this arrangement was by not demanding it end. She found she did not want it to end. This was the practical part of her noting something she would have to account for later. She looked at the partition and said, into the quality of the silence, I know this isn't your car. She did not know why she said this first. It had been in the back of her mind since approximately the first 10 minutes, when she had stopped panicking enough to notice details. The car was the kind of car that did not belong to a hired service. The interior had the specific character of private ownership not many people, not frequently, but consistently won. The smell of it was particular, old and clean, and faintly like something she could not name, something mineral and dark that was not unpleasant. The partition did not open. But she saw, in the mirror she had been watching the mirror since the red light, she could admit this to herself, a slight shift in his posture. The smallest indication that he had heard. She continued. I'm not going to pretend I hired you, she said, because clearly neither of us believes that. She paused. I got into your car because the door was open and I was running, and I needed somewhere to be that wasn't where I was. She looked at the veil in her lap. I'm sorry for the intrusion, nothing. But the car did not stop, either. She interpreted this as neither rejection nor confirmation, and sat with the ambiguity. She said, I ran away from my wedding, in case that wasn't obvious from the dress. In the mirror, she saw his eyes move from the road to the mirror for 1 second. Then back to the road. She continued, because having started she found she needed to finish, the way pulling a thread requires you to follow it. I'm not a person who does things like this. I want to be clear about that. I'm a planner. I'm organized. I make decisions carefully, and I keep my commitments. She paused. Except apparently today. She looked at her hands. Except, apparently, today. The trees continued. The light continued its slow departure, and she sat in the back of a car that was going somewhere she had not been told, and she did not ask where, and the man in the front with the old dark eyes drove on in his deliberate silence, and she had the strangest feeling, not reassurance exactly, nothing that simple, more the feeling of having been heard, even by someone who had not spoken, even through a partition, even in 3 hours of unbroken silence. She was beginning to think the silence was his version of an answer. She did not know yet what the question had been, but she thought she was starting to understand that wherever this car was going, she had perhaps been going there longer than this afternoon. That thought should have been frightening. She sat with it in the long light and found, to her own continuing surprise, that it was not. The gates were iron. She saw them first through the windshield as the car slowed, because the partition, she had come to realize in the last hour, was only opaque from the inside looking toward the driver. If she moved to the center of the seat and looked forward through the glass rather than at it, she could see the road ahead. She had discovered this the way you discover things, when you have been sitting in one place long enough that you start looking at things more carefully than you initially bothered to. The gates were iron and old, not decoratively old, but genuinely old, the kind of age that expressed itself in the texture of the metal rather than its design, a darkening that came from centuries rather than from treatment. They were open. Someone had expected the car. Beyond them, a long approach through old trees, the kind that had been standing long enough to have acquired a dignity that younger trees did not have, their canopies meeting overhead so that the approach was a kind of tunnel, the last of the evening light coming through in fragments. Then, the house. She did not have a better word for it than house, but it was the way you might call an ocean a body of water, accurate and completely insufficient. It was stone, 3 stories at least, with wings extending in both directions and lit windows that gave the evening face of it a quality of inhabited warmth that did not match the scale of the thing. Not a hotel. Not institutional. Someone lived here, had lived here, in the specific way of long occupancy, the kind that leaves marks not on the surface, but in the air. The car stopped. She sat, very still. The driver's door opened. She heard it, the first sound she had associated with him in 3 hours, the quiet mechanical sound of a door. Footsteps around the car, unhurried. Then her door opened. She had told herself she would see him, and that would resolve something. The way seeing a thing resolved the imagination of it, the imagination often being worse, more exaggerated, less legible than the reality. She looked up and understood that this was not one of those situations. He was tall. This was the first and most immediate piece of information, and then immediately after it came the rest. Dark coat, dark hair longer than fashionable, pushed back from a face that would have been described by anyone as exceptional. The kind of bone structure that seemed designed for a different century, angular and precise. Pale skin. And his eyes, which she had seen in the mirror, were even more what they were in person, that dark water gray, old and steady, and looking at her with the same quality they had had in the mirror. The quality of recognition. He held the door and waited. He did not offer his hand. He did not speak. She gathered the dress, an enormous amount of fabric, cathedral length, also not designed for practical situations, and stepped out of the car. They were approximately the same height with her heels on, which meant without them she would look up at him, which she filed away without knowing why. She looked at the house. She looked at him. He was still watching her with that quality, patient and certain, the way things are certain that have had a long time to become so. "I don't know your name," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Alexei," he said. His voice was the first surprise, not in the sense of being unexpected from a stranger. She had no expectations about strangers' voices, but in the sense of having a quality she had not prepared for, low and unhurried, with the faint texture of an accent that was not quite any single region, the kind of accent that develops in someone who has spoken many languages over a long time and carries traces of all of them. "Nadia," she said, "since we're here." He nodded once, the nod of someone who already knew. She looked at the house again. Its lit windows, its stone, its particular quality of having existed long enough to be indifferent to time. "Am I a problem you're managing?" she asked. "Or something else?" He was quiet for a moment. His version of consideration, she was learning, expressed itself in a specific quality of stillness. "Something else," he said. She stood in the evening air in her wedding dress with her ruined heels on, the gravel of his approach, and looked at him in the last of the light and thought about practical people and practical decisions and the thing that had lived in her chest every time she thought about standing at A. Different altar. The thing that had said no, clearly and without ambiguity. She thought about his eyes in the mirror. She thought about 3 hours of deliberate silence that had somehow communicated more than conversation might have. She thought, "I do not understand any of this." She thought, "I am not afraid of any of this." These two things coexisted in her with equal weight as he led her toward the house, not touching, not guiding, simply moving and allowing her to follow. And the door opened before they reached it. Someone inside, staff, she supposed, equally silent, and the interior was warm and lit and smelled like that same mineral dark smell, old and clean and specific. She crossed the threshold. She did not look back at the car or the gates or the approach. She was already thinking about what came next. The room they showed her to was on the 2nd floor. A woman had appeared in the entrance hall, middle-aged and quiet, with the efficiency of someone who managed large things with minimal expression, and had led her upstairs without comment on the dress or the veil that Nadia was still carrying in her left hand, like a question she had not answered yet. The room was large and warm, a fireplace already burning, and she stood in the center of it after the door had been closed and looked around with the particular assessment of someone trying to determine what a space tells you about the person who owns it. Books on the shelves. Not decorative books, not the kind bought by the foot for aesthetics, but read books, with the specific look of things that had been opened many times. A writing desk near the window, with objects on it that were not ornamental. Maps on the wall, some framed and some not. A single painting above the fireplace. A landscape, austere and beautiful, mountains in deep winter. She set the veil on the writing desk. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the fireplace. She thought about Marcus. She thought about her mother. She thought about the logistics of what she had done. The specific practical landscape of it. She had no phone. She had no money on her person. She had no change of clothes. She was in a house she could not have located on a map with a man she had met 3 hours ago, and whose last name she did not know. These were facts. She sat with them, she noted, with the observational part of herself that never fully stopped observing, that they did not produce the level of alarm they should have. Something about the quality of the room, or the fire, or the 3 hours of deliberate silence that had somehow felt more considered and more generous than most conversations she had been in. Something about his eyes in the mirror. Something about the word he had used. Something else. A knock at the door. She said, "Come in." It was not Alexei. It was a younger woman, also quiet, with a tray of food and a change of clothes draped over her arm. She set both down without being asked about either, said that there was a phone on the desk if she needed to make a call, and left. Nadia looked at the phone. She thought about who to call first. Her mother would need to be called. Her maid of honor would need to be called. Marcus, she thought, deserved a call rather than a message, though she was not yet sure she had the words for that call. She needed the words. She ate first. Then, she changed out of the dress, a process that took longer than it should have, because cathedral-length gowns are not designed for solo removal, and she refused to be defeated by her own wedding dress, and after several minutes of architectural problem-solving, she managed it and put on the borrowed clothes, which were simple and dark and fit her well enough to suggest whoever had provided them had an eye for proportion. She felt, in the borrowed clothes, more like herself than she had in months. She sat at the writing desk and called her maid of honor, who picked up on the first ring and said, "Nadia, are you alive?" And she said, "Yes," and her maid of honor said she was going to need a moment, and then said she would handle the immediate situation, and that Nadia should take whatever time she needed, and that she had been right, and they would discuss the rest later. She called her mother, which was harder. She did not call Marcus. Not yet. She would, but not tonight, when she did not have the words, and he deserved the words. She sat at the desk for a long time after the calls. Then she went to find him. She was not sure what impulse drove this. Practicality. Partly she had questions. She was in someone else's house. The normal social contract suggested introduction and explanation. But also something less articulable than that. Something that wanted to know more about the specific quality of his silence, the eyes in the mirror, the word he had chosen. Something else. The house was large, but not difficult to navigate. She went down the stairs and listened. She heard nothing from the main rooms, the kind of nothing that suggested they were unoccupied rather than occupied quietly. She followed the logic of the architecture toward the back of the ground floor and found him in a room that was entirely lined with books and had 2 chairs by a different fire. He was sitting in one of them, reading. He looked up when she came in. He did not look surprised. She stood in the doorway. "Do you always bring runaway brides home?" she said. "No," he said. His tone was not dry exactly. It was the tone of someone who did not make jokes, but also did not exclude the possibility, who lived somewhere in the vicinity of Rye without committing to it. She came in and sat in the other chair, which she did without asking because the chair was clearly there for a second person and she was the second person present. She looked at the fire. She said, "I need to understand what I got into." He set his book down. She said, not in a frightened way, "I'm not frightened of you." She looked at him directly. "That might be something I should examine more than I am, but it's true. I'm not frightened. I'm trying to understand." He looked at her steadily. "What specifically?" "The car," she said. "The open door. The 3 hours of silence." She paused. "Your eyes in the mirror." Something moved in his expression. She continued, "You looked at me like you knew me." She held his gaze. "I know that's not possible." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How certain are you of what's possible?" She sat with this. It was not a deflection, she could tell. It was a genuine question. She thought about what she had felt when she got into the car. The specific relief of it, not just physical relief at having found somewhere to be, but something older than that, a familiar quality in the enclosed space, like a place you have dreamed about and then walked into. She said, "Less certain than I was this morning." He nodded once, as if this was the correct answer, or at least an honest one, which he seemed to weight as heavily as correctness. She looked at him. She looked at the books and the fire and the maps she had noticed through the open study door as she had passed it. She thought about who lives in a house like this with a library like this and eyes like his, and she thought, "I don't have a framework for this yet, but I'm going to build one." She was practical. That was her consistent truth. And practically speaking, she thought, I am exactly where I need to be to find out. She woke to snow. Not the snow of the city, the gray compromised snow that lasted half a morning before becoming something less poetic. This was the real thing, thick and committed, covering the grounds outside the window she had forgotten to curtain the night before, the world outside made white and quiet and entirely different from the version she had arrived into. She lay in the borrowed bed and looked at it. She had slept well. This surprised her. She had expected the specific sleeplessness of a significant day, the way the mind circles back through what has happened, inventorying, reassessing, refusing to be still. Instead, she had slept deeply and without dreaming and had woken feeling, for the first time in months, like she had actually rested. She thought about what this meant. She was careful with the thought. She was a practical person, and practical people did not draw large conclusions from a single night of good sleep. But she sat with it long enough to notice its texture. The way it did not feel like a temporary relief from a permanent difficulty, but more like the absence of a weight she had become so accustomed to that she had stopped registering it as weight. She dressed in the borrowed clothes and went downstairs. He was already in the dining room, not eating, sitting with something to read and a cup of something dark, and she registered without comment that he had been there long enough that the cup was probably not hot. He looked up when she came in, and she noticed that his eyes in morning light were different from his eyes in the mirror, in evening light, in the particular charged light of a red light stop. In morning light, they were the color she had not been able to name yesterday, something between gray and a blue so dark it was almost not blue, like deep water right before storm. "Good morning," she said. He said good morning, and the quality of his voice in the morning was different also, or perhaps she was simply hearing it properly for the first time, the texture of it. She sat across from him. Someone appeared with breakfast for her, silent and efficient, and she ate and he read, and they did not speak for several minutes, which should have been awkward and was not. She was beginning to notice that silence around him had a different quality than silence usually did. Not the silence of two people who had nothing to say or were avoiding saying something. More the silence of two people who did not need to fill space to occupy it together. She said, "Tell me something true about yourself." He looked up from his reading. She said, "We skipped the normal sequence. I don't know anything about you, and I'm eating breakfast in your house, and I'd like to correct that." He looked at her for a moment. Then he set his book down. "Something true," he said. "Yes, one thing. She ate her toast. We can start small." He was quiet, the particular quiet of selection. "I have lived in this house for a long time," he said, "long enough that I am not entirely certain of the exact figure." She looked at him. He looked back. She said, "That's an unusual thing to be uncertain about." Yes, she thought about his eyes in the mirror. The quality of age in them that she had not been able to account for yesterday, and was not closer to accounting for today. "How long?" she said. He looked at the window, at the snow. "Longer than is easily explained," he said, "in a way that also requires explanation." She put her toast down. She was a practical person. Practical people did not, as a rule, have the following thought, and yet she was having it with a clarity that felt physical. She thought about the quality of the air in the car and the house, the same mineral dark quality, like something very old and entirely clean. She thought about his eyes, the oldness in them, the specific kind that was not tired oldness, but experienced oldness. She thought about a door open at the exact moment she was running, a car that drove for 3 hours with purpose, gates that had been open as if expected. She thought about the word he had used, not managed. Something else. She said, "Are you going to tell me something that requires me to significantly reassess my understanding of what's possible?" He looked at her. His expression was doing something careful and deliberate, the way of someone who is choosing the right container for something that has not been contained before. "Yes," he said. He paused. "Is that something you want to hear tonight or tonight?" She considered this. She picked her toast back up. "Tonight," she said. "Give me a day to be in the version of this I currently understand." He nodded, as if this was again the correct answer, or at least an honest and practical one. She ate her breakfast. He returned to his reading. Outside, the snow continued with the commitment of something that had decided. She sat across from him in the morning light, and thought about her life as it had been 3 days ago. The clean and managed progression of it, the invitations and the fittings and the momentum. And she thought about how none of that had produced the feeling of this, the simple feeling of being in a room with the right quality of air and the right quality of silence. And she thought that practical people, when they encountered data that contradicted their existing model, updated the model. She was updating the model. She would continue to do this incrementally and carefully and with attention to the evidence. She looked at him across the table. He was reading, his long dark hair falling slightly forward, one hand loosely holding the book, his posture carrying that ease of someone who was entirely at home in their own space, in a way that went beyond the ordinary comfort of ownership, something more embedded than that. She thought, I want to know more about this. She thought, I have time. She thought, I am, for the first time in a very long time, not running towards something because of momentum. She was here because she had chosen to be. That, she thought, was the entire difference. She found the portrait on the third day. She had been exploring the house the way she explored every new space, methodically and with attention, starting at one end and working through it room by room, not intrusively. She did not open closed doors or drawers. But the rooms that were open to the house she moved through carefully and looked at properly. The portrait was in the long corridor on the second floor, between two windows, in a frame that was darker than the surrounding wall from the accumulated contrast of years. It was a portrait of a man, oil on canvas, in the style of roughly 3 centuries ago. She was not an art historian, but she had enough general knowledge to place the period approximately, and to know that the style of the clothing and the quality of the light were consistent with that period. The man in the portrait had long, dark hair. He had angular features, high cheekbones, a jaw that was defined and precise. He had eyes that were, even in paint, in the specific challenge of pigment trying to represent what she knew as a living quality, recognizably the color of deep water at dusk. She stood in front of it for a long time. Then, she went to find him. He was in the library, which was where he tended to be in the afternoons, and he looked up when she came in and saw her face and put his book down without being asked. She sat in the chair across from him. She said, "The portrait in the corridor." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's you." He was quiet for a moment. Then, yes. She looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about the conversation at breakfast 2 days ago, the thing she had said she wanted to hear tonight, which had now arrived, and the day she had used, which had given her a version of him that was growing familiar in the way of someone you watch closely and begin to understand. His precision. His patience. The specific quality of his care, which expressed itself in what he did not do as much as what he did not press her, did not ask for more than she offered, did not use the power differential of his position and knowledge and the fact that she was in his house with nothing of her own. She thought about his eyes in the mirror. She said, "How old are you?" He looked at her steadily. "I was born," he said carefully, "in the early part of the 18th century. She did the math. She did it twice, because the first result seemed like an error. It was not an error. She sat with the number. Then she said, "And you are what you are because." He told her. He told her with the same precision he brought to everything, not dramatizing, not diminishing. He told her what he was, the correct word for it, the specific way it had happened, the century in which it had happened. He told her enough that she had the shape of it, without the architecture of 300 years of detail, which he said he would provide if she wanted it, but would not impose. She listened. She said, when he had finished, "I am trying to determine what I feel about this." He said, "That's reasonable." She said, "I need to know one thing." He said, "Yes." She said, "The car. The door being open. Did you know I was coming?" He was quiet. He said, "Not specifically, not your name, not your face. She said, but. He said, there are people I have been watching for. Not intending to find. Simply aware that the finding would happen at some point, in some form, because certain things move toward each other over time regardless of intention. He paused. I have lived long enough to understand this as a pattern rather than a belief. She said, and you thought I was one of those people. He said, when you got into the car and I heard you breathe. Yes, she sat with this for a long time. Outside the window, the snow had stopped. The grounds beyond the glass were white and still, and the sky above them was the particular blue of a winter afternoon after weather. She said, I ran from a wedding this morning. 3 days ago. I ran because something in me said no very clearly, and I had not given it room to say it before that moment. She looked at the fire. I do not know if that is related to being here. I do not know if anything I feel in this house is its own thing or part of something larger that I don't yet understand. She looked at him. I am trying to be honest about that uncertainty. He said, I know. And then, I appreciate it. She said, what do you want from this? From me being here? He looked at her with that steady, careful quality. He said, to know you. Whatever that leads to. He paused. I am not asking for anything. I am offering a space in which something may develop if it develops. I am not owed anything by the fact of having waited, or by the way the car door happened to be open. She looked at him. She said, that's a very unusual thing for someone with your advantages to say. He said, I have had a long time to understand the difference between what you are owed and what you earn. She sat with this. She thought about Marcus, who was a good man, who had not done anything wrong, who had practical plans and a practical future, and with whom she had never once sat in a silence that felt like this. She thought about the thing in her chest that had said no. She said, I'm going to stay for a while. If that's all right. He said yes. In the simple, weighted way he said things that meant more than the word. She looked at the fire. She said, I'm not saying anything else tonight beyond that. He said, that's enough. And it was. For that evening, in that library, with the snow-white grounds outside, and the fire between them and 3 centuries of waiting settled quietly in the room like something that had finally found a place to put itself down, it was exactly enough. On the 5th day, she asked him to drive. Not anywhere specific, she said. I want to be in the car again. The request surprised her as she made it, the specific form of it, and she sat with the surprise and did not retract it because it was true and she had decided to be true in this place. He looked at her for a moment. Then, he got his coat. They went out to the car, the same car, still in the drive, and he opened the rear door, and she looked at it, and then said, Can I sit in the front? Another pause. Then he closed the rear door and opened the front passenger door instead. She got in. He got in. They drove out through the iron gates and turned onto the road that wound through the trees and then opened into the wider landscape, fields and hills and the winter sky enormous above everything. She looked at him in profile. She could look at him directly now. This was a development of 5 days. On the first day, she had looked at him the way you look at something you are trying to understand, with the concentrated attention of analysis. Now, she looked at him the way you look at something you are beginning to know, with a different quality of attention, one that was interested in the specific rather than the general, the small consistent details rather than the overall impression. He drove the way he did everything, without urgency, with complete attention on the road, but the kind of attention that was not effortful, simply his natural state. His hands on the wheel were still and certain. She said, What was it like? Driving with me in the back. That first day. He was quiet for a moment. He said, Careful. She said, In what sense? He said, I was aware of you the way you are aware of something that requires precision, not fragile. but important, and I did not want to do the wrong thing. She said, the silence was deliberate. He said, yes. She said, how did you know that was right? That silence was what I needed. He looked at the road. He said, I have watched people for a long time, and people who have just done something that requires great courage, even if the courage is frightened and imperfect, do not need to be spoken at. They need to be given space in which the decision they have made can become real to them. She sat with this. She said, is that what you thought I had done? Something courageous. He glanced at her briefly. Yes. She looked out the window at the fields passing. The snow was thinner out here, the ground showing through in patches, the brown of it almost warm against the white. She said, it did not feel courageous. It felt terrifying and probably selfish, and possibly the worst thing I have done to another person. He said, those things are not mutually exclusive with courage. She thought about that. She said, tell me about the 18th century. Something specific. Something you remember. He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him selecting, the same way she had come to feel all his selections, that quality of precision applied to the question of what to offer. He said, I remember the quality of the light before widespread artificial lighting, the way darkness was actual darkness, not the urban approximation of it. He paused. I remember what it felt like to go somewhere and have it take months, and the specific way that changed your relationship to distance. Nothing felt close. Everything felt like a journey. She said, do you miss it? He said, aspects. The silence mostly. He paused. I have found other versions of it. She thought about the car's interior, the particular quality of the silence in it. She said, is that why the car? It's quiet, he said partly. She said, what's the other part? He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer, which she had come to understand as also a valid response for him, a kind of honesty about the limit of what he was ready to put into words. But then he said, you. One word. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road. She said, you didn't know me. He said, I knew you were coming. Not you specifically, but someone. And I have lived long enough to know that the correct response to that kind of knowledge is preparation and patience, not pursuit. She said, so the car was. He said, ready. She sat with this, the single word, and its weight. She looked at the road ahead, the fields and the winter sky and the hills in the distance with their coating of snow, and she thought about preparation and patience, and she thought about 3 centuries of a man living in a house with iron gates and a library full of red books and a portrait on the wall, and she thought about what it costs to wait for something without knowing exactly what it is or when it will arrive, only that it will. She thought, that is either the most romantic thing I have ever heard or the most alarming. She thought, I think it is both. She thought, I think I am all right with both. She said, I'm glad the door was open. He turned to look at her then, briefly, with those eyes, and the look lasted only a second before he returned to the road. But she had seen what was in it. And she sat the rest of the drive in the front seat beside him, with the winter moving past the windows, and something in her chest that was not the weight she had been carrying for months, but its complete opposite. Something that had the quality of relief, but was larger than relief. Something that felt like the beginning of a direction she had not known she was oriented toward until she was already moving in it. She called Marcus on the 7th day. She had been composing the call in her mind for a week. Not a script exactly, she distrusted scripts. They always collapsed at the first moment of actual conversation, but more a sense of what she needed to say, and what she owed him in the saying of it. He deserved honesty. He deserved an acknowledgement that the form of her leaving had been wrong, even if the leaving itself had been necessary. He deserved her not pretending it was about him. Because it wasn't. And that was both better and worse than if it had been. She made the call from the room on the second floor, sitting at the writing desk with the window showing the grounds, the snow that remained on the far edges of things. He answered on the third ring. She said, "Marcus, I know this is very late." He said, "I know." He said, "I also know." He meant he had known, she understood, before she had known, or at least before she had let herself know, and the generosity of this, of what he was offering her with those two words, produced in her a specific emotion that was not love, but was deep and genuine. They talked for 40 minutes. She told him the truth, as much of it as was his to have. She told him she was sorry for the form of it. She told him the marriage would not have been right for either of them, which he confirmed quietly, in the way of someone who had also been managing something and was relieved to put it down. She told him she hoped he would be all right. He said he would. She believed him. When she put the phone down, she sat for a long time. She thought about 2 years, about the specific texture of a relationship that is comfortable and reasonable and contains real affection and is not the right thing. About how long you can maintain momentum before the thing beneath it catches up with you. She thought about 1 week in this house. The comparison was not fair, she told herself immediately. 1 week against 2 years was not a comparison any practical person should make. She knew almost nothing real about this person, nothing that was not surface and suggestion and the specific quality of his silences. She knew that he was old in a way that required the word centuries. She knew that he had been waiting for something he could not name, and she had arrived. She knew that the house had a quality of rightness that she could not entirely account for. She knew that she had slept well every night. She went downstairs. He was in the library and she came in and sat in the chair and did not speak for a moment, and he put his book down and waited. She said, "I called him." He said, "How was it?" She said, "Honest." And then, "Better than I expected." And then, he knew. "Before I did, I think." He said, "That sometimes happens." She said, "The people closest to something see it most clearly." He said, "Or least clearly." Depending, she looked at the fire. She said, "Do you ever regret things, the length of time you've had, the things that have happened in it?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Yes." She said, "What do you regret?" He said, "Not specific events, more textures. The times I was not as careful as I should have been with something that deserved care." He paused. The assumption, in the early centuries, that time was without limit, and therefore nothing was urgent. He looked at the fire. "Things are always urgent. I understand that now." She said, "Is this urgent?" She gestured between them. "This, whatever this is." He looked at her steadily. He said, "Yes." And then, "But urgent does not mean rushed. Those are different things." She said, "You're very precise about distinctions." He said, "I have had time to find them important." She looked at him across the fire. She looked at his face, the angles of it, the long dark hair and the old eyes, and the quality he had of being entirely present without performing presence, simply here, fully, in a way that she had not encountered before him, and was beginning to understand she had been looking for without knowing the name of it. She said, "I want to understand more about you. I want you to tell me things, not the overview. Specific things, one at a time." He said, "What would you like to know first?" She said, "The painting. The one in the corridor. Who painted it?" He said, "A woman I knew in the early 19th century. She was a portrait painter of considerable skill who had, he said, a theory about eyes, that eyes in a portrait were the only part that could either succeed completely or fail completely, with no middle ground. She spent 3 weeks on his eyes alone. She said, "She got them right." He said, "So I'm told." She said, "Who told you?" He paused, Everyone who has stood in front of it and then looked at me. She thought about herself standing in the corridor 3 days ago. The recognition. The way the painted eyes had been the thing that told her before the rest of her mind caught up. She said, she was important to you. He said, she was a friend. For a long time. He said, I have had very few people I trusted enough to call that. He said it simply, without seeking sympathy, as a fact among facts. She said, how many? He said, across 3 centuries. She would be the 4th. She sat with this number. She said, and now. He looked at her. His expression was doing the thing she was learning, the controlled surface and the large underneath. He said, I think. Possibly, a 5th. She held his gaze. She said, I think so too. Possibly, something at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile yet, but its precondition, the thing that comes before when the possibility first registers. She looked at the fire. She was still sad. A little, for Marcus, and for the 2 years, and for her mother's disappointed investment in a version of her future that was not going to happen. She held this alongside everything else, because the sadness did not contradict anything she was feeling, and she was not going to pretend it didn't exist. But she was also here. In this room, with a person who had 300 years of learning how to be precise about what mattered, and who was looking at her with the quality of someone who had found something worth being careful with. She thought that she could work with that. She thought. A 5th. Possibly, she thought. I am going to make very sure of the possibly. The snow came back on the 9th day. Not the tentative first snow of their arrival, but something heavier and more committed, covering the grounds again by mid-morning, and still falling by the time the light had gone from gold to gray. She stood at the library window and watched it come down, and felt the same thing she had felt watching snow every year of her life, a specific permission to be still. He came in behind her, and she heard him, and did not turn immediately. He came to stand beside her at the window. They watched the snow together. She said, in my family we had a word for this. Not a real word, a family word. Her grandmother had invented it. The feeling of watching snow from indoors, the simultaneous warmth and cold. He said, some languages have words for things like that. The Mireth dialect had one, he said, for the feeling of being sheltered by something larger than yourself. Not gratitude exactly. Something more embodied than that. She said, what happened to Mireth? He said, the people who spoke it were dispersed over several centuries. The language lost its speakers gradually. By the 17th century it was effectively extinct. She said, do you speak it? He said, I did. A version of it. He paused. I have not spoken it aloud for a long time. She said, say something. He looked at her. She said, in Mireth. Say something. He was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, a handful of words, something that was not like any language she had heard, rounder and more internal than the languages she knew. The sounds made more from breath than from the hard edges of consonants. She said, what does it mean? He said, approximately, the shelter of something that has been standing long enough to know how. She looked at him. She said, that's specifically what you said, not a general phrase. He looked at the snow. He said, it's what seemed accurate. She sat with this. The shelter of something that has been standing long enough to know how. The specificity of it. The way he had not reached for something simple or deflective, but had chosen the true thing, which she was learning, was always his choice, when he made one. She said, when did you know? She paused. That I was going to be significant to you, he said. When you got into the car, and I heard you breathe, he said, not what it would look like, just that it would be something. She said, what did my breathing sound like? He said, frightened. And then, underneath the frightened, something else. something that knew. She looked at the snow. She said, "I think I knew too, when I saw the door open, not what I was walking into, but that I was supposed to walk into it." He said, "Yes," she said. "Is that a vampire thing?" The knowing. He looked at her briefly. He said, "It's a time thing. When you have lived long enough, you develop a sensitivity to certain kinds of significance, like a change in pressure before weather." She said, "And I was a change. In pressure." He said, "You were a change in pressure." She looked at the snow and thought about this, about the car door open at the exact moment she was running, about the 3 hours of deliberate silence, about his eyes in the mirror, already looking, as if he had known. She said, "Do you believe in things being meant?" He said, "I believe in tendencies, in the way certain things move toward each other over time. I am cautious about the word meant. It implies something outside the thing itself." He paused. "I prefer to think that some things have a direction of their own," she said, "and we have a direction." He said, "I think so." She said, "I think so too." They stood at the window. The snow fell. The grounds became white and still, and the library was warm behind them, the fire making its small sounds, the books on their shelves accumulating their centuries of accumulated patience. She turned from the window, and he turned with her, and they were facing each other in the library light, closer than they had been standing at the window, because turning from a shared view does that, closes the angle. She looked at his face. She looked at the precise angles of it, and the long dark hair, and the eyes that were the color of deep water, and that held their 300 years of experience without heaviness, with a quality more like depth than weight. She said, "Alexei." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to be clear about something." He said, "All right." She said, "I am here because I chose to be, not because I had nowhere else to go, although that was true on the first day, because I have chosen each subsequent day to remain." She held his gaze. "I want you to know that." He said, "I know." She said, "And I want to keep choosing it." He was very still. The quality of his stillness had changed. She had learned to read this, the different kinds of it. This was the still of something that had been carrying itself carefully for a long time and had been given permission to set the weight down. He said, "I would like that very much." She took a step closer, not reaching for him, just closing the distance. He did not move away. She said, "You're going to have to get used to someone asking you questions. A lot of them. I am constitutionally unable to not ask questions." He said, "I know this about you already." She said, "It's been 9 days." He said, "You've asked 412 questions." She stared at him. He said, "Approximately." She felt the laugh before it came, sudden and real, and he looked at her when she laughed with an expression that was becoming her favorite expression of his, the open warmth that he had stopped trying to fully contain. She put her hand on his arm. His hand came over hers, deliberate and certain. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside the library, they stood in the firelight, and she thought about a door that had been open at exactly the right moment, and a man who had been ready for something he could not name, and 3 hours of deliberate silence that had been the kindest conversation she had ever had. She thought, this is a direction. She thought, I would like to follow it. She asked him to show her the house properly on the 11th day, not the rooms she had found herself, the library and the dining room and the corridor with the portrait, but the rest of it, the parts that were not public-facing in the way rooms near the entrance tended to be. The parts that told you more about the person who had been living in a place for a very long time. He said, all right. He took her through it methodically, which was the only way he did anything, starting at the ground floor and working upward. He did not narrate like a guide. He simply moved through the rooms and stopped where there was something worth stopping for, and occasionally said something. A date, a provenance, the name of someone who had been connected to a particular object. There was a room on the ground floor at the back that was clearly a workroom, a large table in the center covered in papers and objects, the walls lined with shelves that held things she could not immediately categorize, small instruments of various kinds, materials, objects whose purpose was not visible from their form. She stood in the doorway and looked, and he stood beside her. She said, "What do you do in here?" He said, "I study things." He paused. "I have had interests that have changed over the centuries, and some that have not." He pointed to a section of shelving, languages for most of my life. He pointed to another, more recently the question of how things change over long periods of time. Not history exactly, more the texture of change. How things that seem permanent turn out not to be. How things that seem fragile outlast the things that seemed permanent. She looked at the shelves. She said, "Which fragile things?" "Specifically," he said, "ideas, languages, the small habits of particular people." He paused. "I have watched entire systems of power rise and fall, and what outlasts them is never the power. It's the way a specific person held their cup, or the particular joke that a community made about itself, or the word that a dying language had for something that no other language quite captured." She said, "You have a very particular way of caring about things." He said, "I have had time to discover what I actually care about, distinct from what I was expected to care about." She said, "What were you expected to care about?" He was quiet for a moment. Power, lineage, the accumulation of the things that were considered markers of significance. He paused. I was not unusual in this. It was the world I was born into. She said, "And what do you actually care about?" He looked at the shelves. He said, "Small, precise things. The word in Mareth that does not translate. The specific quality of silence in this house when the snow is thick enough to absorb all outside sound." He paused. He looked at her. "Breakfast, when there is someone across the table." She held his gaze. She said, "That last one is new." He said, "Yes." She looked at the workroom, at the shelves with their accumulated materials of a long life spent paying attention to things other people had moved past. She said, "Can I come in here sometimes?" "To read." "While you work?" He said, "I would prefer that to the alternative." She said, "Which is?" He said, "The library. When you are in the library and I am here, the quality of being in the library changes." She understood what he meant. She felt it herself, the way a room changed quality when a specific other person was not in it. She said, "That's very honest." He said, "I'm trying to practice honesty. It does not always come naturally." She said, "You seem honest to me." He said, "I am honest when I am certain." He paused. "I am still learning to be honest when I am not certain." He paused. "Which is most of the time now." She looked at him. She said, "Why most of the time now?" He said, "Because certainty does not tend to coexist with caring about something. Once you care about something, the uncertainty enters." He said, "I had become accustomed to a version of life that had less uncertainty." He said, "I find I do not mind the uncertainty." He looked at her. "The way I do not mind it is in itself a form of certainty about something." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "What are you certain about?" He looked at her steadily. He said, "That this is right. Whatever this is, that the direction is correct." He said, "I have been alive for 300 years, and I have learned to trust the sensation of something being in its correct place." He paused. "You are in your correct place." She breathed. She said, "I feel that." She paused. "I want to be careful about how much weight I put on 11 days. He said, "Be as careful as you need to be." She said, "But I feel it." He said, "I know." She looked at the shelves. She said, Show me what the word for shelter sounded like again. In Myreth. He said it. The sounds rounded and internal, made more of breath than edges. She said, and there is a word for the feeling of something being in its correct place. He said, yes. He said it. She listened. The sounds of it settled in her the way certain things settle when they are the right thing. She said, I want to learn that word. He said, you have time. She said, we both do. He looked at her. Something in his face, the open, warm thing, fuller and less guarded than she had seen it before. She put her hand in his. He held it. They stood in the doorway of the workroom, and she looked at the evidence of 300 years of paying careful attention to things that most people moved past, and she thought, this is a person I could spend a very long time with. She thought, I think that is what I am going to do. Her aunt came on the 14th day. This had not been planned. Her aunt did not plan things in the conventional sense. She made decisions and then executed them, which was either the same thing as planning or its complete opposite depending on your definition. She had received Nadia's letter, which had explained the situation in approximately the level of detail Nadia had felt was appropriate for a letter, and had responded by appearing. She arrived in a car that was considerably less impressive than the one Nadia had arrived in, and got out of it in the drive, with the expression of someone who was performing no judgment until she had gathered sufficient information. She looked at the house. She looked at Alexei, who had come out when he heard the car. She looked at Nadia. She said, you look well. She said this in the tone of someone who had been prepared for something worse and was revising their expectations in real time. Nadia said, I am well. She said, this is Alexei. Her aunt looked at him with the direct assessment of a woman who had spent 60 years developing good judgment about people and had lost faith in social convention as a method of disguising it. She said, how old are you? He said, older than I look. She said, how much older? He said, considerably. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, all right, and went inside, which was her aunt's version of provisional acceptance. Nadia knew, the indication that she was willing to gather more information before forming a conclusion. They had lunch, the three of them, at the long dining table that Nadia now felt comfortable in after nearly 2 weeks, and her aunt asked Alexei questions with the specific precision of someone who had decided the normal conversational approach would not be adequate here and had adjusted accordingly. She asked him about the house. He told her its age and its history briefly. She asked him about himself. He told her approximately what he had told Nadia, with the same precision and the same absence of drama. Her aunt sat with this for a moment. She said, and my niece. He said, is someone I would like to know for a very long time, if she chooses that. Her aunt looked at Nadia. Nadia looked back. Her aunt said, and you? Nadia said, yes. She said it with the clarity of something that had been building toward that word for 2 weeks and had finally reached it. Her aunt nodded. She picked up her fork. She said, I have 2 concerns. She said, the first is practical, and I will address it privately with Nadia later. She said, the second is this. She looked at Alexei. My niece is someone who manages herself very carefully, who is precise and organized and controlled, and who has not, in my observation, ever in her adult life allowed herself to move toward something without understanding it fully first. She paused. She got into your car without understanding it at all. He said, yes. She said, I want to know what you think that means about her. He was quiet for a moment. The selecting quiet. He said, I think it means that some part of her understood something that the part of her that usually manages things had not yet been consulted about. He paused, and I think that the part that understood it was correct. Her aunt looked at him for a long moment. She said, that's a careful answer. He said, I try to be careful. She said, So does she. Her tone shifted slightly, towards something that was not softness exactly, but its practical equivalent. That's either a problem or a very good thing. He said, I think it will be a very good thing. Her aunt looked at Nadia again. Nadia said, I think so too. Her aunt ate her lunch. Later, after Alexei had excused himself with the tact of someone who understood when two people needed to talk, her aunt sat across from Nadia in the library and said, Tell me. Nadia told her. She told her more than she had put in the letter. She told her about the car and the silence and the eyes in the mirror. She told her about the portrait and the conversation at breakfast and the word something else. She told her about Mirith and the shelter of something that has been standing long enough to know how. She told her about 11 days of choosing each morning to remain, and what each morning had felt like, and the quality of the silence in the house at night. Her aunt listened. At the end, she said, And Marcus. Nadia said, It was the right thing. He knew also. Her aunt said, I know it was. I knew before you did. Nadia said, Why didn't you say anything? Her aunt said, Because you needed to find it yourself. Information given before you're ready for it isn't information. It's noise. Nadia sat with this. She said, My grandmother used to say something like that. Her aunt said, Your grandmother was a very wise woman. She paused. She would have understood this, I think. Nadia looked at her. Her aunt said, Not the specific circumstances, the feeling of it. The sense of something finding its correct place. She was quiet for a moment. She always said that the most important things had a quality of inevitability about them. Not that they were forced, that they were in the correct direction. Nadia thought about what Alexei had said. The direction of things. Tendencies. She thought about a car door open at exactly the right moment. She said, I think I'm in the correct direction. Her aunt said, I think so too. She left the next morning. Not because anything was wrong, but because this was her aunt's way to gather the information, make the assessment, go back to her own life. She hugged Nadia in the drive and said in her ear, quietly, He looked at you twice while we were at lunch, when you were not looking. The same way both times, like he was making sure you were still there. She got in her car. She drove away through the iron gates. Nadia stood in the drive and looked at the house. He appeared in the doorway. She said, She approves. He said, I know. She said, How? He said, She stopped looking for things to disapprove of around the third question. That's usually the sign. She laughed. He looked at her with that open warmth. She walked up the steps and through the door and back into the house that had become, in 14 days, the place she wanted to be. On the 21st day she stayed, she stood at the window of the library at dusk and thought about the version of herself who had run down an alley in heels 3 weeks ago. She thought about her with the specific tenderness you extend to a version of yourself who was doing the most important thing without knowing it was the most important thing. Running from something, not knowing she was running towards something, arriving at a door that was open because something had been ready for her. She thought, that person had more courage than she knew. She thought, I am that person still. She was still careful, still organized, still the practical person who had grown up in a house where timing mattered and who had built an instrument for measuring intervals. The instrument was still running. She was still herself. She was also something she had not been 3 weeks ago. Oriented, that was the word she had found eventually, after trying several others. She was oriented in a direction that felt correct, in the way that correct directions feel not forced, not effortful, simply the way she was pointing. He came in as the last of the light left the window. She turned. He looked at her, standing in the dark of the library, the fire not yet lit for the evening, the room in that specific blue-gray of dusk. She said, I want to tell you something. He stopped where he was. He did not come closer. He gave her the room. She said, I have been thinking about what I am doing here, and I have been thinking about it very carefully, because I am a person who thinks carefully about things." She paused. "And I want to tell you the conclusion." He waited. She said, "I stopped thinking about it as something that requires a conclusion." She looked at him across the room. "I am not deciding whether to stay or what this is, or how it compares to what I understand. I am simply here." She paused. "I am simply here, and I am choosing it. And I am going to keep choosing it. And that is all I need to know right now." He was very still. She said, "I also want to tell you something else." He said, "Yes." She said, "I am not frightened." She looked at what his face was doing in the dusk light. "I know there are things that should be frightening about this. The scale of it. The time. The difference in what we are." She paused. "I am not frightened. I am curious, and I am attentive, and I am entirely certain that this is the direction I want to be going." He crossed the room. He moved with the deliberateness of someone who had decided and was enacting the decision precisely. He stopped in front of her and looked at her in the last of the light, his face at close range with those old, steady eyes, and the long, dark hair, and all the careful patience of a person who had been standing long enough to know how. He said, "I want to say something also." She said, "Yes." He said, "I have been alive for 300 years. He said it plainly, not for weight, but for context, and I have, in that time, been careful with almost everything." He paused. "I have not been careless with resources or with words or with the few people I have trusted." She waited. He said, "I was careless with one thing." She said, "What?" He said, "Hope. I stopped allowing it in the way you stop allowing something when it has cost you enough times." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "And then you got into the car." She looked at him. He said, "And I found I was not as careful about hope as I had believed." She breathed. She said, "Alexei." He said, "Yes." She said, "I am very glad the door was open." He said, "So am I," in the simple, weighted way that meant everything it was possible for those words to mean. She put her hand on his face. The way you touch something you have decided is yours to touch, deliberate and certain. He closed his eyes for a moment. She stood in the dusk of the library in a house with iron gates and a portrait on the wall and shelves full of the evidence of 300 years of paying careful attention. And she thought, this is it. This is the thing that has a direction of its own. This is where the running was going. Down the alley and across the wet pavement and through the open door. Through 3 hours of deliberate silence and eyes in a mirror and every careful day of 21 that had followed. She thought, I am in the correct place. She thought, I am home. She kissed him, and he kissed her back with the weight of someone who had not allowed himself to hope and had been wrong in the best possible way, and the fire had not yet been lit, but the room was warm anyway, and outside the iron gates the road went on into the dark, and inside the library 2 people stood in the last of the dusk, and were, both of them, precisely where they had always been going. She stayed. She kept choosing it. Every morning, the same choice. Every morning, the same answer. That, she thought, was everything.